Welcome back, Super Magical Cup fans, to the 11th episode of our History of the Metagames series. In this episode, we're going to be covering the game updates that came in the May 3rd patch. In the last video, we covered all of the balance changes, so if you want to see how existing cards got changed, check out that video. This one is going to cover all of the changes that were made to the app itself, as well as the 6 new cards that were added with this update. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to Super Magical Cup on YouTube, and check us out on twitch.tv/SuperMagicalCup every Saturday at noon Pacific for the best and most competitive Clash Royale tournament in the community. We covered what the meta was like in the last episode, so let's just talk about all the great changes that were added in this update. 2 changes that were very impactful to the game was the crown chest being doubled. So crown chest used to be the equivalent of only 1 golden chest, and now they were 2 golden chests combined. Also, clan requests went from, well, they used to be 10 commons or 1 rare no matter what. No matter what arena you were in, no matter what trophy count you were, it didn't matter. It was always 10 and 1. This made later progression very, very slow, because once you were in Legendary Arena and needed 1,000 commons to level up your card, getting them 10 at a time was just, it was such a drag. In this update, depending on what arena you were in, you would get more and more requests. So you could request 10, 20, 30, 40 commons depending on your arena, and 1, 2, 3, or 4 rares per request. This dramatically increased the ability of people to go from level 8, 9, 10, etc. With their commons. This was really important because this was the first update to implement the common tournament cap that we all know now. Prior to this update, tournament cap was level 1 legendaries, level 3 epics, level 6 rares, and level 8 commons. This raised the levels of epics, commons, and rares to 4, 7, and 9. This allowed tournaments to be much more balanced, especially with regards to legendaries, which were too strong in the old tournament cap, and epics were just a little too weak. So the combination of these 2 changes introduced us to the new tournament cap that we still have today, and I think it feels just great. Far better than the old one that they used to have. These changes to the clan requests and to the crown chest income did a great thing in terms of allowing players to actually go from the initial ramping up of the game where you're like level 4, 5, 6 into the tournament cap of being level 9. It was such a grind before to go from level 6 to 7 commons, 6 to 7 rares, requesting them only 1 at a time, that I think this change of requesting multiple rares at once was a huge smoothing out of the progression for those players. This patch also introduced the first of many ways for players to get more and more gold. Playing a battle didn't cost you any gold, but it also didn't earn you any gold. This was the first update where you could earn a little bit of gold based on which arena you were in for every 1 battle, up to 20 per day. In a lot of ways, this could be called the spectating patch, because live spectating was introduced. We saw an early preview of it at the Helsinki tournament where those matches were watched with the live spectator mode, but it wasn't available to everyone until this May 3rd patch. In addition, one of the most requested features was TV Royale for every arena, and this patch delivered. Prior to this, TV Royale was only the top 50 players. There was only 1 channel, it was TV Royale, and every match had someone who was in the top 50. So it was normally like the 50th place player against the 120th place player, etc. With this change, players were able to watch TV Royale no matter what arena you were in and get an idea of decks you could play, other tactics you could learn from without having to look at players who had all the cards unlocked and maxed out. You could also copy players' decks. Now this was something that, we talked about this in a past episode, this was the perfect sort of feature. People asked for it, and once it was implemented, it was never asked for again. It's just a perfect thing. It just worked fine. So with this change, you would be able to go to players' profiles and hit the little arrow button in order to copy their deck directly into your deck slots instead of having to manually write down the cards and rebuild it yourself. A similar change was the ability to rearrange decks within the deck list. So prior to this is a really funny little change because you just think about it, it feels like it's always been in the game now. But you know how when you go to add a card, you have the ability to move around cards within your deck? Prior to that, you couldn't, you had to do that one card at a time if you really wanted to. It's a very small change that added a lot of quality of life to playing and building new decks, being able to rearrange the cards within a deck. Very welcome change. In addition to the tournament cap changed, the max levels were changed in order to mimic the ratios of tournament cap. Legendaries were reduced by 1 from a max level of 6 to a max level of 5, and commons were increased from 12 to 13, and rares increased from 10 to 11. This was the most dramatic change to the ladder max cap meta ever, especially when you consider that lots of players had maxed out epics, commons, some had some maxed out legendaries, and it was a dramatic change to have to refund people who had spent a lot of money to get a level 6 legendary. In addition to this change, the number of epics needed to go from 7 to 8 was reduced from 300 epics down to 200 epics. Every player who had legendaries beyond the level 5 cap and epics beyond that 200 cap, so the extra 100 epics, all of those players received massive gem refunds. The day this patch was released, many streamers found themselves with 100,000 gems or more, and they were able to spend those gems in order to acquire the new cards. In addition, the changes at the top of the ladder were not just adding a new level, doubling the number of cards needed, but rather it was a refactor. I remember only needing after the change, I had max level commons. After the change, I was part of the way to level 13. It didn't start me right at 0. I actually had several of the cards already on the way from 12 to 13. And the same thing happened with rares. And the final game change, something that was probably very exciting for a lot of people, was that the chance to get a SuperMagicalCup was changed from a random 1 in 1,000 chance to a fixed 500 chest cycle. You can find out more about this on other channels and other videos, but basically SuperMagical chests used to be completely random, and now every player is guaranteed to get them if they play long enough. But on to the new cards, always the most exciting part of a new game update. 6 cards were added in this, including an unprecedented 3 legendaries. 6 new cards were added, 1 common, 1 rare, 1 epic, and an unprecedented 3 legendaries. The common and rare were related. It was Fire Spirits and Furnace. If you can remember a time before Fire Spirits and Furnace, then you are old like me. Fire Spirits was a really welcome new card because, as Rainey mentioned in a past episode, Barbarians and Minion Horde were really common. Almost every deck ran one or the other of them because without a lot of cheap cycle-y cards in the game, there wasn't really cycle decks per se. There was a lot of big, powerful, battleship-y sort of cards being played back and forth. Fire Spirits gave players a new way, a cheap and effective way no less, to combat minions, Minion Horde, Barbarians, and other higher cost troops. Furnace was awesome because it was the first new spawner added to the game. Goblin Hut and Barbarian Hut and Tombstone were in the initial launch set of cards, so this was the first new spawner to be added to the game. Furnace, however, was not very powerful and took a long time for it to find its niche because it cost 5 elixir. It actually had the same duration that you see today, but really just costed 1 more elixir. It goes through a few balance changes before finding its niche, but it's important to remember that while Furnace had a lot of excitement for it, it was pretty weak on launch. The epic introduced to the game were guards, 3 skeletons that had shields on them. This was the first new shield card since the Dark Prince in the last balance update, and while guards were very cool mechanically, it took a while for them to catch on. Unlike Furnace, which was just really underpowered at launch, I think guards, even though they do receive a large buff later, were actually pretty good at launch. The reason why you didn't see more guards was because it's an epic. It took a long time for people to unlock them. Guards unlocked in Royal Arena, so not every player had immediate access to them, and it took a long time for players to get their epics up to level 2, level 3, and eventually level 4 for tournaments. The 3 new legendaries were, I'd love to say that they were welcomed, but actually people were very concerned about new legendaries. It was very hard to get Ice Wizard and Princess because when there's only 2 legendaries in the game, it's actually harder to get any legendaries. More legendaries being added increased the overall drop rate for legendaries for all players, so you were more likely to get any legendary, but simply Supercell announcing that 3 more legendaries were coming in had a lot of players worried. Sparky was probably the most anticipated and most excited of the new cards. It's a big rolling machine. It was the first troop to deal more damage than itself had health, so people were excited about the idea of just doing an insane amount of damage. In fact, it was considered very overpowered and broken when it was first spoiled. But Sparky has the unique trait of being the only new card ever released to never receive a balance change. Lavahound was the first big tank legendary to be released. All the other legendaries we've discussed have either been support cards or just cheaper. Lavahound, when it was first announced, I think a lot of people were excited about it, but it turned out to be a very confusing and difficult card to understand how to use. Some people had the idea of doing all air decks, but in reality, Lavahound's mechanics of being a tank that explodes into lava pups required some very unique play that took a lot of players several months to figure out. Miner turns out to be the most powerful of the new legendaries, but it wasn't very obvious at first. Shortly after the patch came out, Supercell actually buffs the Miner because Supercell said that people weren't using the card and they wanted more people to take a look at it. People were kind of underwhelmed by it at first. They thought, well, it's worse than a knight, and I guess it can be summoned anywhere, but who really cares? And it turns out months later, everybody will care that it can be summoned everywhere, but at least at launch, Miner was not a very hyped up card, and I don't think people understood the power and the new decks that would become enabled by the release of Miner. So these new cards were a great addition to the tournament gameplay. I would never want to go back to a time in Clash Royale pre-Miner, Lavahound, Sparky. These were great cards to add to the game. And of course, Furnace, Fire Spirits, and Guards have become the fundamental cornerstones of many different defensive strategies. Well, that does it for History of the Meta number 11. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to SuperMagicalCup on YouTube. Check out the rest of the History of the Metagame series. Check out our other content series. And of course, tune in every Saturday at noon Pacific for the SuperMagicalCup on twitch.tv/SuperMagicalCup. I'll see you in Legendary Arena.